So greetings, hello, it's Thomas Daffern here again, and it's the second part of my talk at this Pyrenees Conference we were holding, and yesterday it was in Alley-les-Bains, and I'm going to finish my talk. I didn't complete everything I had to say. There were lots of other speakers, and we ran out of time as normal, so we're now very close to Mount Bugarach. I can see that. We heard from Susie Harrison yesterday about Bugarach. Well, we're speaking from within sight of that mountain, and we're staying at Susie Harrison's herself. So I'm going to be summarising and finishing off my talk, and I hope that people find it interesting. It's like a supplement, extra bonus talk for the Pyrenees Esoteric Conference. The first point I want to make, and by the way, we're here on Lunasa. It's the 31st of July, coming up to, well, this evening and then tomorrow, Lunasa, starting at dusk in a few hours. So in my final farewell talk yesterday, I talked about Lou and the many, the polymathic nature of people and how that's our natural right, in a sense, to the genius that each of us is, and why that seems to have been stimulated by the Pyrenees region. And I've explained why I think it's because of a kind of cosmopolitanism in the region historically. And I just want to, just for a minute, give tribute to the British residents who have moved here. There's quite a lot of them. I've just got to know a few, but there's an amazing variety of people from Britain who remain British citizens, but they're based here in the Pyrenees region. Many, probably tens of thousands, and they're all very interesting people. They've been studying esoteric mysteries, philosophy, maybe the Mary Magdalene mysteries, writing books, giving conferences, and people come from all over the world to visit here because it's one of those cosmic centres of cosmic wisdom. This Mount Bugarach is awesome, and as I said in my talk yesterday, I think it's connected with through the Silk Road of Gnosis with the Taoist mountains all the way in China. And every culture has revered mountains because they give us the higher perspective, higher view of things. And that's why we call higher level education higher education, because it enables people to see a long way. I was just in Toulouse where the tomb of Thomas Aquinas is, where he's buried, and Thomas Aquinas was one of those scholars that gave us a higher view, higher perspective. And so was, in his own way, Mani, so were all the great prophets and spiritual teachers of humanity. Anyway, there's a lot of people here in the Pyrenees, British. They're opposing this nonsense of Brexit, which is Britain as a culture stands for this higher wisdom. We pioneered things like Freemasonry and science and the Royal Society and the higher picture that John Dee and Queen Elizabeth I and all that, the esoteric mysteries that flowed from that. And before that, Roger Bacon and the founding of the University of Oxford, people like Grose-Tester, the great Bishop of Lincoln, who was a scholar and Chancellor of the University of Oxford. That higher perspective that Oxford and British academia stands for is what I represent. And here in the Pyrenees, it's alive and well. We can't allow Brexit and its kind of dumbing down of what it is to be British or English to win. Defining the British soul as some kind of national project is ridiculous. We're an international culture. That's what the Union Jack stands for. It's the saints of the island, David, George, Patrick, and interestingly enough, David's flag is not part of it. But anyway, it stands for that unification of the saints' perspective. And the saints see things from the bigger picture. So that's what, to me, the Pyrenees stands for. And a lot of the Brits I meet down here, they're like living saints, quietly getting on with the mysteries. We should honour them and not do Brexit. And it stands for that internationalism, as opposed to this ridiculous neo-nationalism that Steve Bannon, Nigel Farage, and these hard-right racists are trying to, reinvent Europe as a nationalist project. No, my friends, it's not. It's a global internationalist peace project. Europa herself was a Phoenician princess, right? Semitic Phoenician princess. And the greatest philosophers of Greece, Thales, Pythagoras, they were part Phoenician. Phoenician traders used to come to these coasts in the Pyrenees 1,000 years before Christ. They helped build Solomon's temple. which is the foundation of the Freemasonic mysteries. So, you know, the mysteries are alive and well, and let's celebrate them. And Brexit is anti-intellectual, anti-spiritual, the people living here who would suffer disastrously if Brexit is allowed to continue. So that's why I'm pledged to fight it from an esoteric and spiritual and philosophical or metaphysical basis, as well as all the political and economic arguments. Okay, so I now want to go on and talk about the pagan culture of the Pyrenees. Why is it important? Where do we find it? Well, it's alive and kicking again in groups, individuals, intellectuals that have been working on the ancient history of these regions. As I say, the very history of humanity is bound up with these mountains, the cave systems, the finding of the Magdalenian art traditions. And this is a culture where, you know, our ancestors first began to celebrate those mysteries. They probably had, as I said in my talk yesterday, initiation rituals deep in the caves. This is where art came from. They would have been doing, as Graham Hancock says, out-of-body experience, trance work, using art, magic, dance, and music. And that's where we became human, in effect. So some groups continue with those traditions, those old magical traditions, to this day. And, you know, it's entered popular mainstream culture with the things like Glastonbury Festival and Psytrance and the whole celebration of life that's about. Also, in the Pyrenees, there's a lot of folklore, what's called folklore. And the Folklore Society, who has its academic library incorporated into University College at my University of London, you know, folklore studies are very interesting, and people have written about the Pyrenees region. Each spirit, each valley has its own spirits, each mountain, like Bugarach here. And there's names for them all. The Daunas Daiga were the feminine divinities. Sometimes they looked like mermaids or fairies, and they were seen in the lakes of this region of the Pyrenees, also in the fountains and rivers. But they lived also in the caves. There's also a lot of respect given to the bear, as I said, but even in modern folklore and alive in this region, in the Béarn region, the locals call the bear the loup pédescu, the one who goes barefoot, or loup musu, the gentleman, to show their respect. And there's a carnival of bears every year, the Carnaval de l'Ours, and people dress up. Somebody dresses up as the chief bear, and it's a huge, big thing in the Pyrenees region. Now that's fascinating because that comes from prehistory, from the Paleolithic people, for whom the bear was a representative of the chief divinity. And the Celts in this region also revered the bear as indeed the ancestor of human beings, in some ways of thinking. In cultures that have kept alive bear worship in the Amur River Valley in the Siberian region, you know, they say the bear is sacred. They have an interesting and rather tragic custom, actually. What they do, and this was written up by anthropologists, is they adopt a little bear cub who's been captured in the wild, and they then rear it, they nurse it, and the women give suck to the little baby bear. They take turns so that the bear can drink human milk. They treat it like a little baby, and they raise it for a little while, a year or so. And then, unfortunately, this is the human story, they then sacrifice it in a great ritual, which they called sending the bear's spirit back to the mountain. They do it with love, they've reverenced this little bear, and they then have a big, like it's a huge festival, a ritual, that the whole region come to. And they set the bear's spirit free, it goes back to the mountain. You know, these people were hunters, and but at least they're doing it with reverence, and it's, you know, it's amazing that that cycle of life and death is being reenacted among these bear reverencing cultures, and it's very probable that the ancestors of the Pyrenees did the same thing. And it's probable that we see in that ritual, which is probably one of the very oldest rituals that have survived intact from prehistoric times, we see the reenactment of what Robert Graves talks about, the sacrifice of the king, the ritual sacrifice of the king for the benefit of the people, which then becomes enacted in the Christian rituals. Christ, the bear king, lays down his life for the people. Well, it's possible that, it's almost certain, I think, that those rituals date back to the ancient bear sacrifice cult of prehistoric Pyrenees and other cave-dwelling regions. The entire circumpolar area did this, it's thought. This is what anthropologists are piecing together. And it seems to be that's kind of the origin of a lot of what Christians believe in. Because what happens is, when the bear is sacrificed, they share out sacrificial bear meat as part of the cult. And, that's the mass, in effect. So, anyway, I'm just reporting on this. Other things in the folklore are very interesting. The bear is very important. The wolf in this region, the horse, the sacred donkey, the snakes. All these animals are seen as magical. And there are fairies in every forest, every mountain. Folklorists have studied their names, but it goes back to the most ancient times, and it's extremely interesting. Okay, moving on. I want to talk briefly about theology, because we touched on it a lot in the conference yesterday and it bound, but we didn't have time to really go into it in depth. So what was the Cathar theology, and where did it come from, and where did they learn those traditions? This is all very interesting. It was largely oral. We know that the Cathars, who would have been once here in this village, in Bugarach and on the mountain and in this entire region, they were taught by wandering Gnostic priests who called themselves Cathars, or good men, good women. They could be men or women. They just had the knowledge in their heart. They learned by purity of spiritual remembrance, if you want. And the key text, is the Sermon on the Mount. I've been to the place where the Sermon on the Mount was given in North Galilee, on the Mount of the Beatitudes, it's called. You can see the Sea of Galilee looking down from it. And Christ said in that, the most important of the things was, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the pure in heart is kathar in kardia in the Greek, for they shall see God. That is the proof text for the Cathar heritage and the entire Gnostic Christian tradition. The question is, how do you become pure in heart? What is that? The word Cathar means pure. How do you purify your heart is through a lot of spiritual struggle and intellectual struggle. We're all born, it's difficult being a spiritual being, soul. If you believe in reincarnation, then for many times over, and you come into a body, it's difficult to make it work. You're like a really sentient thinking being trapped in a little body that, at first can cause illnesses. You can get ill, it's painful, lots of pain a lot of the time, especially as a child. And then emotional difficulties. How do you master your feelings? How do you deal with conflicts in relationships and bullying at school? A lot of people are in turbulence and turmoil a lot. It's not till you get a bit older that you learn maturity and how to control emotional reactions and so on. That's all about becoming pure in heart, becoming purified. It's the Christian way of talking about what Buddha calls enlightenment. The philosophical path of Buddhism for enlightenment is the same as the Cathar Gnostic Christian path towards enlightenment and purity of heart. And as well as an oral tradition that was handed down from Jesus and the first saints and Mary Magdalene and the people that were pioneering this, in extremely difficult times. They were being persecuted. They were being killed when they were found. They were being silenced. The reason Jesus didn't speak up when he was brought before Pontius Pilate and asked what is truth in a kind of mocking way is because he was silenced effectively. Of course, he could have given a 24-hour lecture on truth. And I wish he had. And I wish he had, I wish his teachings had fallen not on such barren ground at that time. He knew what was going on. He said in his great metaphorical teachings that a word of truth is like a seed. It goes out and it falls into land which will devour it, where weeds are. this is kind of evil people that oppose truth, that silence the saints. And then sometimes it will fall on good soil and grow into a flourishing tree. It's kind of luck of the draw. Jesus got some luck, but a lot of pain and suffering. And in that sense, he's an archetypal pioneer for all of us. All our spiritual development is a mixture of joy and ecstasy and pain and suffering. Christ reenacted, this is what Jung says, it's an archetypal life. That's why we resonate with it. And the role of Mary Magdalene is so epic because it's the help me, consort, supporter, wisdom mate of the king who must die, the bear king, if you want. So it was handed down orally. Now that can be retraced, as my friend Yuri Stoyanov has tried to do from the University of London. This Gnostic Silk Road was people passing on the stories. Muhammad got some of them later on this Gnostic Silk Road. A lot of what becomes the Quran is from the same source. It was oral, and then it's written down by the scribes and packaged, and it becomes a holy book. The Gnostic Cathars had their own. They had scriptures like the earlier Gnostics had the Pistis Sophia, which was a very important text. J.J. Hertak has done a big commentary on it. It's an extraordinary text that tells how, in the beginning of creation, the absolute light, the absolute logos, sort of created Sophia, who descends from that absolute purity of where time and space meet in love, with conscious wisdom. Sophia descends and has her adventures as a goddess, creator in her own right. And she then gives birth to Yaldabaoth, who's the demiurge of this planet. And it's Yaldabaoth who's a beginner god. He's not that good. He's the child of Sophia. I mean, he means well, but he creates a world in which there's too much suffering and too much ignorance. He doesn't, create a world that is fully enlightened, like some explorers of consciousness say our world should be, or Buddhists call it pure land. They say that's in another dimension, which we can only reach after death. Other people say it's in different, planetary systems in this universe, which is vast. I don't know. I suspend judgment. But, this world isn't that yet. Buddhists call it the Shambhala kingdom. They say that it exists on the etheric planes, but the manifest world we see is full of suffering and pain and wars and carnage and genocide and holocausts and Jews fleeing the Nazis and, Cathars fleeing the Inquisition, Protestants being, burned alive, and then Catholics being tortured. This world is in turmoil. So that's all because Yaldabaoth got it wrong. And so what had to happen, this is the Cathar belief, is that then the Supreme Lord, the creator of the entire universe, took pity on this planet, our suffering and our pain, and he sent his offspring, his own son, if you want, or his light, a ray of his own being, to incarnate down into this world from the highest of heavens, above and beyond even Yaldabaoth's world. And that was Jesus Christ, incarnate here, to bring the divine teachings of absolute purity and love down to this world system, so that we can wake up to our true heritage, because we humans are supposed to be answering the law of the Supreme Lord, the creator of the entire universe, not the fallen god Yaldabaoth, who's caused all the trouble by his silliness. One way I could put it is that Yaldabaoth is the lord of intelligence operatives who interfere with our lives. They're all spies against spies. They're doing fake information. They're creating wars. They're doing 9/11s. And, it's all Yaldabaoth having fun, having chaos. Chaos magic comes from it. We would probably call this Satan. Like it's an evil force. But I would say, like a Platonist, that it's just ignorance. Yaldabaoth has a good side. It's just he doesn't know what he's doing. And it's all got out of hand. Okay, there's that level of reality. Beyond that is the level of true faith, true love, true light, true wisdom. And that's the spiritual grace that my country, UK, that's our religious faith, from the saints like Columba and St. Alban, and all the great saints of my tradition, who have spoken from the highest heaven on behalf of that Supreme Lord of love, incarnate in Christ, to bring us redemption from evil and suffering. So, that's what I call the wisdom agent level. That's higher than the intelligence agents who are causing the havoc. The wisdom agents just work with love and non-violence. They never do violence. You can't. Ahimsa is the law of the Supreme God. Violence is a stupid thing that ignorant, fallen Yaldabaoth followers do. So this Pistis Sophia explains it all. Read it. Look at the commentary by Hertak. The Apocryphon of John is another text the Cathars had. They also use that. They also love John's Gospel, because St. John's Gospel is the most profound and deep, and it puts in a number of teaching texts, what I'm saying. It's called the Gospel of Signs. And some people, Jack D'Angelo, who's a great spiritual healer, and others, believe, they've done a lot of research on it, that the Gospel of St. John is actually the Gospel according to St. John and Mary Magdalene. And he speculates, and other scholars are saying, that Mary Magdalene must have worked with John on that text. It's a lot of her teachings and remembrances of Jesus that got into the text we call John's Gospel, because they wanted to put his name as the front man on the cover, so that the secret wisdom that was being shared in those signs were not dismissed by the Peter Church as, oh, that's just Mary Magdalene having fantasies about stuff, because they were dismissive of the feminine wisdom, and that's tragic. Another book that the Cathars had, and they used to use John's Gospel as their most holy of the texts, right? They don't seem to have had the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. That was found much later, recently. I've done a commentary on it. They didn't have it, but they had it orally. They were from the same source that had it. They did have a thing called the Gospel of the Secret Supper, which is a text that was actually in there. They had it. It was also in the Bogomil community of the Balkans, who were Gnostics too. The Gospel of the Secret Supper is St. John, who's a very important figure, asking Jesus at the Last Supper how the universe got to be the way it is, why it's full of pain and suffering and violence, and what should we do? What have you come to teach us? And it's a complicated, like a Pistis Sophia type eschatological framework for the deeper form of the Christian faith. And John is taught by Jesus a lot of secrets. The Cathars loved that book, as did the Bogomils. Then we have a thing called the Book of the Two Principles, which is a text that's written in like a scholastic medieval Latin by an Italian Cathar scholar, which there were some, who was probably university trained. And he explains why the Cathar theology actually makes sense, what I've just sketched out, that suffering and evil can't come from that supreme God. It's a mistake. It's we fell. Our demiurge got it wrong. It's like when the bank sends you a bill for £1,000 and you have a nervous breakdown because their computer system got it wrong. That's happening all the time on this planet. The computers are like Yaldabaoth's great tools, because they're always crashing and getting bugs and, etc., etc. They look great, but actually it's causing a lot of people to panic, and constant emails saying, you're overdrawn by £20, it's enough to make you have a heart attack. Well, that's all the Yaldabaoth. And what the Cathar theologians said, and the man who wrote the Book of the Two Principles, is all that pain and suffering isn't from God, the Creator, and it's not from, the ultimate source of goodness. It's from ignorance, which is a derivation from what should be on this planet. And so Christ's attempt to bring in that second cosmic principle of goodness and wisdom, that's what we as Christians or esotericists or philosophers should be doing, because we love wisdom, which is the supreme source of goodness. Okay, that's a little brief overview of the theology of the Cathars. I could go in a lot more and, detail, but people can find this out. And there's still research to be done. We don't know all the details, because a lot of the archives and records we have are the inquisitorial records when they declared these people heretics. These people were just thinking through the difficulty of how we explain evil and suffering. Buddha did the same. Buddha started from the fact of evil and suffering, and he said non-violence, truth-telling, virtue, that will get us out of suffering, both individually and collectively. That's the path to enlightenment. These Catholic Christians were just trying to walk that path. And along that Gnostic Silk Road, there were a lot of Buddhist influences, a lot of Jain, and they were all put together by Mani, who had studied at the feet of great Buddhist sages and great Jains, and Zoroastrians and Taoists and all the rest of it. So, fascinating stuff. Next point to discuss is the Celtic traces. Are there any Druid sites known in this region? How did the Celts get here? Well, yes, this is fascinating to me as a Druid peace officer and so on. There were lots of Celtic sites all over this region since very, very ancient times. And there are archaeologists now who are beginning to think that the Bell Beaker people, who originated in northwestern Spain, Portugal, who seem to have developed bronze as a metal substance by marrying up tin and copper, actually were Celts, proto-Celts. And they did a lot of mining in Ireland and even Wales. Archaeologists have found both tin and copper mines in Ireland, which enabled these Bell Beaker people to develop very highly sophisticated bronze equipment, all kinds of jewellery, but also swords and all kinds of things. And they seem to be Celts, and it's them that then moved north into Britain and Ireland themselves. And this is thought to be the Celtic cultural infusion, which is described in the invasions of Emergin and the Gaels into Ireland, and the famous Emergin poem when he lands in Ireland. He comes from Spain, from northwest Spain. And so some archaeologists are now saying that's the origin of the advanced Celtic cultures. And there's more mines been found for tin and copper in Ireland than anywhere else in Europe at the time. It was the centre of the Bronze Age. So that's really interesting. Others would say the Celts, who were active also in Central Europe, Austria, Germany, with the Hallstatt culture, were not just in the Spanish area, but much wider across Europe. And then the Latin cultures brought the Iron Age to Europe, were Celts. They advanced Iron Age working. So the tribes of Hispania, or Spain, were also partly Celtic, is what's thought. And archaeology is exploring all this. It's absolutely fascinating. So 3 tribes at least are known to have been here. And in the spiritual traditions of the Pyrenees, we know the names of some of the gods here from the Celtic times. There was a god Urg, and there's a pantheon of Pyrenees deities from the Gallo-Roman times, because the Romans came into the region and they kind of merged with the Celts, and they created in the whole of Aquitaine a pantheon of Romano-Gallic deities who had sanctuaries around here. And we were just learning yesterday that on Mount Bugarach, it's thought, the legend locally is that Bug and Arach were deities, giants, another word for deities, trying to reach Jupiter, the supreme god, and then they clambered on top of each other and couldn't quite reach him. But that's Mount Bugarach, which is here, and we'll probably shoot some filming of it. And anyway, what's interesting is that in the Celtic Gallo-Roman world, Jupiter became Jupiter Poenus, the Jupiter of the summits. And on the St. Bernard Pass in Switzerland, going into Italy, there was a temple to Jupiter Poenus, the Jupiter of the summits. And he was the god of the highest mountain peaks. You pray to when there's a disastrous storm or there's lightning. And so he was a Celtic deity, but Romanized. And the Celts linked Jupiter also with their supreme god Taranis, who was the god of thunder and lightning, and the god that you appeal to in absolute extremity. If your plane is catching fire and the wheels are burning and the pilot is about to ditch, then you pray to Jupiter. in the ancient times, or to Tyrannus. And Tyrannus is shown with a wheel in ancient Gallo-Roman sculpture times and in temples, because the wheel is the symbol of Tyrannus, which is the wheel of time, the chakras, the wheel of energy which cycles, the chakras that the Sanskrit wisdom yogis talk about were known about by the Druids, and those were the wheels of Tyrannus. The Kala Chakra Tantra, the highest form of Buddhist Tantra, talks about the wheel of time's recurrence, like the Mayan calendar. So all this was known also by the Druids and the Etruscans. And our job as Druids and sages is to figure out the time, you know. Instead of asking what time is it 4:45 yet? No, you ask, what's the cosmic time? Is this the time to be virtuous or the time to be criminal? It's the time to be virtuous. That was the point of Christ's teachings and the Cathars and Mary Magdalene and the Druids. So that's why they were welcomed here. Another god that's important is Abellio. He was important in this whole Pyrenees region, another Celtic god. And we now know that just near here, near Narbonne, there was a port which was Celtic. It was one of the most important ports of the whole of southern France, and it was helped to be settled by Etruscan traders. Huge amounts of Etruscan ware, pottery and metalwork, very artistically beautiful, was imported into Gaul from Etruria, long before the Romans were even important. And the Etruscans were the intellectuals of the Italian peninsula, the traders, the savants, and the sages. Etruscan religion was highly sophisticated, just like Celtic Druidry. The two were intermeshed because the Gauls lived in northern Italy, Cisalpine Gaul. We know that they spoke to, learned from, intermarried with the Etruscan sages. And the Etruscan science, the Ars Etruria, which was studied by the Emperor Claudius, by the way. He wrote a great book which has been lost tragically to history on Etruscan religion. Varro wrote about it. The greatest Roman scholars knew how much they owed to the Etruscans. They owed them the alphabet, which is the Roman alphabet. No, it's the Etruscan alphabet. It's what we all use in Western Europe. And with it, there was a teaching of time. The saeculum was the Etruscan word for the cycles of time. The word temple is an Etruscan word for a magical space that is mapped out by the Etruscan priest, in which they then watch for signs. They watch for the bird passage, the sunlight, the lightning, etc. And they would then interpret this. This would be the interpretatio of what's going on in the templum. And then that templum was then built as a permanent fixture, like a temple, we call it. That's an Etruscan word. So the Etruscans were just down the road here, in a huge harbour at Narbonne. There's now a big museum there. Archaeologists have only discovered this in the last 20 years. But they know from all these Etruscan things found all over Gaul and off into Austria and the Rhine Valley, that these Gauls, these Celts and Druids were sitting at the feet of the Etruscans, and to some extent vice versa. So, that's the kind of intellectual, cosmopolitan, intertribal sharing for wisdom that Europe does at its best. That's what we should do. The Roman Empire was a bit barbaric, and it didn't quite understand that it's far better to send a few philosophers to study things than a load of legions. If Claudius, instead of invading Britain, had sent some of his greatest philosophers to learn what the Druid teachings were, the whole of history would have been much more intelligent. But the dear man, he married badly, I think. That's the problem with Claudius. And one of his wives killed him off in the end. Very tragic. Okay, so now moving on. And I've got lots of lists of these Celtic deities, and I'm writing an encyclopedia of Druid studies at the moment. Okay, why did Mary